In this section, we're going to be covering the legal aspects of the HERS profession. This is the reference for most of the stuff that we're going to be talking about in this section. These are the HERS regulations. The latest version is dated August 2009. That's the link that you can be found at and available for download. You can also download it from the training website as well, the one that you're taking right now. And that's the website of the California Energy Commission, by the way. Anytime you see www.energy.ca.gov, that is the California Energy Commission website. So, what is ethics? Most of us think as ethics in very personal terms. The word actually assumes a much greater meaning the minute we become part of an organization or an established group of people. Obviously, there's a lot of legalities involved with being a HERS rater, and that's what this section is about. At that point, individuals' values are not enough to define what behavior will or will not be acceptable or tolerated. It's going to vary. Our opinions are going to be different. Definitions of right or wrong may vary, even if the group is composed of individuals who all consider themselves to be ethical. So we're here to ask the question, what is ethic? So overall training goal is to understand the legal and ethical implication of the HERS profession, provide a quality assurance along with its expectations and requirements. This particular PowerPoint is divided into three sections. We have ethics, we have HERS regulations, and we have quality assurance, and they will be covered in that order. So these are some questions that I want you to ask yourselves, and you're also going to be answering these questions in a separate assignment within the online management system. So these are things that you should be asking yourself. There is no right or wrong answer to any of these. They're really opinion based, but I want to get your perspective on what you think the answers to these particular questions are. So what is ethics and why is it important to act accordingly to a code of principles? Why is business ethics becoming increasingly important? What are corporations doing to improve business ethics? Why are corporations interested in fostering good business ethics? And what approach can you take to ensure ethical decision making? And these are really questions that you should be able to answer, at least personally, because you're going to be asking yourself some of these questions probably as you go along into the HERS profession or just in life in general in anything that you do. It's important that you have an opinion about this, and it's also important for us to know that you and us are on the same page. When I say us, obviously I'm talking about Cheers. The you and Cheers are on the same page when it comes to ethical behavior. So this is a quick definition of ethics. Ethics are defined as a system of moral principles. They can be rules of conduct recognized in respect to a particular class of human action or a particular group, culture, etc. It can be a moral principle as an individual. And then obviously it's also the branch of philosophy dealing with values relating to human conduct with respect to the rightness and wrongness of certain actions and to the goodness and badness of the motives and ends of such actions. So we all have our own different idea of what ethics is, and we probably have our own interpretation and definition of what it is. But those are the vocabulary definitions of ethics. So why is it important? Companies, government agencies, and nonprofits are now including ethics as a critical part of their employee training and management. I think a lot of it falls back on, I guess you could say, liability. The reality is the fact that if, for the most part, if you can think of a situation where you might not act ethically, there's going to be consequences. So that's why companies are important, are pushing ethics, generally speaking, as part of their training program and so forth. It's important for you to think about that, whether, again, you're working for a company or whether you're an individual. Within the organizational context, ethics is a system of rules and principles of behavior within a group against which actions can be judged. So any company has some kind of operations manual. That operations manual is full of rules that you have to follow. Those rules are most likely based on the company's ethical standards that they chose to put their employees under. That's generally speaking what it's based on. Obviously, it must be agreed upon by all members of the group to ensure consistency of action. Integrity. So the importance of integrity. Your moral principles are statements of what you believe to be rules of right conduct. A person who acts with integrity acts in accordance with a personal code of principles. Integrity is one of the cornerstones of ethical behavior. So obviously people say integrity is the one thing that cannot be sold, right? You can only give away your integrity. I find that personally to be true. As long as you act with integrity, generally speaking, you should be following an ethical behavior. Nonetheless, the definition of integrity can vary from person to person, but again, keep it in the foremost in your mind when acting in a particular way, and especially when it comes to the HERS procedures and the HERS regulations. We'll talk about what is legal and what is not. Keep these concepts in your mind when you are signing paperwork and conducting ratings and being in the field and seeing different things. So why is fostering good business ethics important? Obviously, to gain the goodwill of the community. If people know that you act ethically and you do everything on the up and up, obviously people are going to trust you. Your name is going to spread is in good nature. To create an organization that operates consistently, to produce good business, to protect the organization and employees from legal action, and to avoid unfavorable publicity. These are all very business related reasons. But at the end of the day, fostering good business ethics is important because it's just the right thing to do. Aside from, we want our company name to be well received, we want good business, we want repeated business. At the end of the day, acting within business ethics is just a good thing to do. It's the moral right thing to do. And these are just a couple of scenarios that you might encounter. So how management can affect employees' ethical behavior. And this is obviously scenario number one. So what this relates to is the fact that if you do work for a company, you as the individual could have great ethics. You know what right or wrong is, and you want to do right from wrong. But nonetheless, management or higher ups can push you in a certain direction because maybe they have different ethics than you. Maybe the company that you work for doesn't quite see things the way you do. So therefore, management can definitely have an effect on your ethical behavior. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're asking you to do anything illegal. It just might mean that their interpretation of ethics might be different than what you're thinking. So in this particular scenario, the manager set and hold people accountable for meeting stretch goals, quotas, and budget. So that's the action of the manager. Now, a possible employee reaction can be, my boss wants results, not excuses, so I have to cut corners to meet the goals that he has set. So obviously that could be a gray line, right, that you can cross back and forth. So by cutting corners, you could potentially fall into unethical behavior because now you're cutting things that should be done, but because you have to work within a certain time frame, because maybe you want a bonus, certain things are not going to get done to standard. Second scenario. The manager fails to provide a corporate code of ethics and operating principles to guide decision making. And the possible employee reaction may be, because there are no guidelines, I don't think my conduct is really wrong or illegal. So a manager, a company should provide you with some kind of guidelines, but nonetheless, just because a company doesn't tell you about certain guidelines doesn't mean that you shouldn't follow them. For example, we're going to be covering legalities of the HERS profession in this particular PowerPoint. If you end up working for a company and the company doesn't cover the rules of the HERS regulations that you should follow, it doesn't mean that just because they didn't cover them that you don't have to follow them while you work for them. And this is the same principle. Not knowing a rule doesn't mean that it's okay for you to go against it. In this particular scenario, the manager fails to hold people accountable for unethical action, and a possible employee reaction may be, no one will ever know the difference, and if they do, so what? So again, we hold ourselves to a personal standard. Just because other people are not reprimanding unethical behavior, it doesn't mean that we have to lower our standards to theirs. Anytime you accept a lower standard, you just set a new standard, which is a bad one. So keep that in mind. If you know that somebody's doing something wrong and they're not being reprimanded for it, obviously approach your manager and say, hey, look, this is what I'm saying. I don't think it's right. I think something should be done about it. But at the end of the day, you cannot force the manager to do something about it. If they choose not to do anything about it in that particular scenario, keep in mind that you want to do the right thing for yourself within the ethical behavior realm. So remember that. Just because somebody else is not being reprimanded for doing something wrong, it doesn't mean that you should not care, and it doesn't mean that you should also follow down that path. These are the 7 steps for ethical decision making. So this is just a structured way to make ethical decisions. Obviously, you want to get the facts. You want to identify stakeholders and their positions. You want to consider the consequences of their decisions. You want to weigh various guidelines and principles, get some kind of feedback, get outside perspective. You want to develop and evaluate your decision. You want to review it, and then you want to evaluate the results of what happened after you made your decision. And this is kind of an ever evolving process. So it's not really linear, but it's more circular in nature, because you might be going through multiple cycles of this structure while going through the same decision. So keep that in mind. In order to evaluate the decision, which was the last step of the previous slide, this is called the CLICK model. So this is an acronym. CLICK stands for consequence, legal, image, culture, and not. And the reality of it is the fact that you can use this particular model to evaluate what the decision outcome was, or whatever it is that you did. So the consequence, what are the consequences if I do this? Who will it benefit? Who will suffer? Is it legal? What's it going to look like if I actually do this from the outside? What kind of perception are people going to have? Does the decision support or damage our organization culture and values? And ultimately, the K for not, does it cause a knot in my stomach? Will my mentor or hero approve? So generally speaking, we always have a sixth sense, right? We know if what we're about to do is somewhat right or wrong. And we can feel that. Most of the time, we follow that feeling and we know that it's wrong, so we don't do it. But sometimes we choose to ignore it. So the reality is the fact that fundamentally, you'll know if you have to stop and think about of what you're doing. You'll just feel it. But nonetheless, this is a model that you can use to evaluate whatever it is that you're about to do. So are personal ethics enough? And where's the distinction between individual values, ethics, and the standards and policies of an organization or profession? So what does that mean? So are personal ethics enough? If you were to be hired from a company, is you as an individual, your personal ethics, are they enough to keep you going and keep you out of harm's way? Should an organization add their additional values to you? And there is no right or wrong answer to this, I guess. This is more a personal question for yourself. And where's the distinction between the individual value and, again, the values of organization? These are all opinion-based questions. There is no, obviously I cannot tell you the answer to that question. I can tell you that different individuals will mesh differently within different companies, because different companies will bring different ethical guidelines and values to the table. So a lot of times it's just being able to work for the right company that matches your own personal values. So when it comes to ethics, obviously you want to walk the talk, right? We talked about ethics, we talked about what they mean, we talked about what you should be doing and how you should be thinking. And it's all well said and done to talk about it, but obviously we got to do it, right? So walking the talk consistently demands that our decision-making skills include competence, which is the ability to recognize an ethical issue when it appears, confidence, the assurance and self-esteem to seek out different points of view rather than making the decision alone, and tough-mindedness, the strength to ultimately to make a decision and act even though there is no guarantee that there is an absolute right decision. So keep in mind that a lot of times making an ethical decision is not an easy thing to do. And that could be because it's not exactly the right decision, but nonetheless is the ethical decision. And also, if you're working for an organization, it could be going against what the organization is trying to tell you to do. So it's important that you stand your moral ground and you do what you think is right. And sometimes that takes courage, that takes strength, and that definitely takes confidence to go the distance. Ethics must guide not only what we do, but how we do it. Um, I'm sure some of you have heard the expression by any means necessary, or the end justifies the means. So those are ethical statements. So it's not about what we do, but it's how we do it. It doesn't matter what the end result is. We have to think about how it is that we got there. Was it right? Was it ethical? Did I put somebody in harm's way, or did I break some kind of code in order to get to my end result? And those are things you want to think about. So now we'll be covering in a little more detail HERS regulations, which kind of ties into what we just talked about for ethical behavior. So here's some definitions that we're going to be mentioning here. So financial interest. So in regards to financial interest, the regulations define that as an ownership, interest, debt, agreement, or employee-employee relationship. Financial interest does not include ownership of less than 5% of the outstanding equity securities of a publicly traded corporation. Independent entity, that basically means that having no financial interest in and not advocating or recommending the use of any product or service as a means of gaining increased business with firms or persons specified in section 1673J of the HERS regulations. And just to note, the definitions of independent entity and financial interest, along with section 1673J, prohibit conflicts of interest between providers and raters, or between providers, raters, and builder subcontractors. And we'll talk about in a little more detail that in a sec. So what that really means, it basically means that a provider, such as Cheers, so Cheers is a HERS provider, we cannot directly employ HERS raters who are going to be going out and conducting ratings in the field, or there cannot be a subcontractor that hires directly a rater to do the same. That's because that would be a conflict of interest. If an independent rater is being paid by a subcontractor to test their homes, the perception of that is the fact that the contractor holds a financial grip on the rater. Therefore, it could force the rater to skew the ratings whichever way he wants, which obviously we don't want that. So this is just a funny cartoon to kind of visualize conflict of interest. You have a doctor giving a prescription to a patient that says, try this, I just bought 100 shares. This would be a perfect example of what conflict of interest actually is. And this is the same principle as in a builder subcontractor relationship, a builder HERS rater relationship, HERS rater subcontractor relationship. It would be biased for a subcontractor to have financial ties to the rater because of the reasons that we mentioned before. And this is just a funny way to represent it. So raters shall be independent entities from providers. Raters shall be independent entities from the builder and from the subcontractor installer of energy efficiency improvements, field verified or diagnostic tested. And then raters shall be independent entities from any firm or person that perform works on the home for a California home energy audit or a California whole house home energy rating. And please keep in mind that these rules are not just applicable to Cheers. Any HERS provider in California has to follow these rules. So that's what we talked about earlier, independent entities. There cannot be any financial interest between a rater and a provider, between a rater and a builder or a contract or a subcontractor and so forth. And now we'll talk about quality assurance. So quality assurance is conducted after the rater conducts the ratings. HERS providers, which is Cheers, shall conduct quality assurance reviews independently from the rater to evaluate each rater's California whole house home energy ratings, California home energy audits, and field verification and diagnostic testing required for verifying compliance with the Title 24, Part 6 of the Building Energy Efficiency Standards. So these are general guidelines. So QA raters that work for Cheers and only for Cheers are going to go after the rater completes the ratings to verify that the work was actually conducted to standard. And these are the guidelines that the QA raters follow, the Cheers QA raters. So home chosen for Cheers QA evaluations are randomly selected by Cheers. At a minimum, QA percentage thresholds are met by rounding up to the nearest whole number for each measure tested by a rater. And then raters are not informed that a building installation will be field checked until after they have completed the original rating and all paperwork. That's including CF3Rs and whole house rating report. Obviously, you guys are not going for the whole house rating certification, but nonetheless, that's the rules. So basically, the QA will not be conducted until all the paperwork from the rater has been submitted to the provider, because the paperwork will be QA'd as well. All QA evaluations and associated results conducted by Cheers QA personnel are documented in the Cheers database, and then the QA reports are placed in the rater's file. Within 5 business days of receiving a request from a rater, an electronic PDF copy of the completed QA report will be sent to the rater. So first of all, once you as the rater complete a rating, the QA will be done afterwards. you will be notified of the results of that QA. So you're going to be notified of when the QA was conducted, the location of the QA, what was actually QA'd as far as the measures that they were QA'd, and then they're going to be letting you know whether you passed or failed, or whatever in between. And these are the stages of QA. So you have your initial review, you have your tested home annual QAI, your sampled homes annual QAI, and your database total QAI. So the initial review will basically have Cheers QA personnel conducting an initial review of rating documentation on at least the first 5 homes that are rated by you once you become a Cheers rater. And please keep in mind that a home rated under Cheers direct supervision during a rater certification process will not be counted in the 5-home requirement. So this 5-home requirement, this initial 5-home requirement, strictly has to do with a file review of documentation. We're not actually going out to the house. We're just reviewing files to make sure that your paperwork seems to be done correctly. And it says at least 5 because it could be more. If we find problems, obviously we're going to look at it a little further. After we complete that QA on the paperwork, then we actually have tested homes annual QAI. And QAI, by the way, is quality assurance inspections. Cheers QA personnel will annually evaluate the greater of 1 rating or 1% of the raters past 12 months total numbers of ratings. That's rounded up for each measure tested by the rater. Raters upon demand also must be able to provide equipment calibration logs for the blower door and associated equipment within the last 3 years and show proof of current calibration of other equipment in accordance with the specification found in the residential appendices. So we're going to be covering calibration in detail for every piece of equipment once we get to those sections. But when we're talking about QA and the calibration logs and the calibration of the equipment, that's also an inspectable item. So it's not just about the paperwork, it's also making sure that you use the proper equipment and the equipment was calibrated properly before you conducted a test. And then we have sampled homes. So we'll talk about sampling later, but basically as a HERS rater, you're not testing every single home. I mean, you could if you're contracted to do so, but for the most part, you're testing one house and then grouping X amount of homes with that one test. And that's done because theoretically all the homes are supposed to be built the same, theoretically. Again, you're going to run into issues. But nonetheless, that's the idea. So in the previous slide, we talked about the homes that you actually tested, but then Cheers also goes and QAs the sampled homes to make sure that there is no problems in those particular homes. Now, keep in mind, the sampled homes are homes that you never actually went into. You just added them to the original lot that you tested. So we're going to be checking those mainly to make sure that everything is on the up and up, but we realize that you have no control over what is going on in those homes. So we're still going to QA them. We're still going to let you know what we find. But if we find any failures in the sampled homes, those are not going to count against you. So for sampled homes, it's for houses or installations passed as part of the sample group, but not field verified or rated by a rater. Cheers QA personnel will evaluate again the greater of 1 house or 1% rounded up of a rater's annual sampled houses or installations. And then in addition to tested and sampled, then you have a database total QAI. So Cheers QA personnel will perform QAI on 1% of all annual ratings. That's both tested and sampled, conducted through Cheers from the entire pool of ratings in the Cheers database. So this is not done on an individual HERS rater, but this is done on the overall Cheers database. So as a provider, we have to test individually 1% of each rater tested and sampled homes. But then on top of that, we as Cheers have to do 1% of the overall database, which includes all raters. So therefore, that means that this may result in some raters having more QAI done on their work than the minimum required, because there might be situations where we have to do additional ratings or additional QA ratings overall to meet this particular rule. So your particular quota might have been met, but we have to do additional testing in general, and at that point it becomes random. Whatever it is that we test, and it's not specifically to one single rater. So what happens if you fail? So obviously if you pass, everything is great. You're notified that you pass and you move forward. So if a rater works does not pass the 1% QAI, then 2 additional ratings of the failed measure performed by the same rater within the last 12 months will be evaluated by Cheers QA personnel. In addition, Cheers will report a QA failure on its rater registry website for a period of 6 months. That means that if we go into a house and we test the house for whatever measures it is that we were QAing, and one of those measures fails, we have to test 2 additional of those measure types in other houses that you've done. And we'll talk about what happens with those additional tests, but nonetheless, we have to do additional QAs, what it comes down to. In addition to that, we have to report you as having a failure on our website. Now, our website is not going to specify what you failed in. The website basically is just going to specify that you have had a QA failure within the last 6 months. If you have no additional failures after that, then the mark will just automatically drop off after the 6-month period. Now, if a second deficiency is found in the 2 additional ratings evaluated, like I mentioned, then the rater shall have 2% rounded up of his or her ratings of the failed measure evaluated for the next 12 months by all providers. So the general QA is 1%. If you fail the 2 additional QAs after you failed the first one, you get bumped up from 1% QA to 2%. And that 2% follows you with all providers. So let's say that you hold multiple certifications from multiple providers. If you fail 2 QAs in addition after the first failure, we call the other providers, we notify them and say, hey, this guy has failed the additional QA. So if he's certified under you, you also need to bump him up to 2%. So if additional failures occurred in 2% QA review, the rater will be subject to the Cheers corrective action process, which we'll talk about in a sec. So basically, keep in mind that at this point, you have failed quite a bit. So you failed the first one. We test 2 additional ones. Those fail again. At that point, you get bumped up to 2%. And then you fail again. So now you're at about 4 or 5 failures in a row. So at that point, that's an established pattern, and that's why now we're going to take you through the corrective action process. So depending upon the nature of the QAI failure and at the discretion of Cheers QA personnel, the rater may be subject to being placed on probationary status and required to obtain additional training and recertification at his or her expense. The rater may also be subject to immediate additional QAI and or placed on a suspension or permanent decertification status depending on the nature of the QAI failure. So we'll talk about different types of QI failures that we might encounter or determine. But basically, if we get to that point where you're past the 2% and you still fail, the range of options available to Cheers to deal with you are wide. So we can either do a suspension, we can do a temporary decertification, we can do additional training that you would have to pay for in order to get certified again. Or if we found that it was straight out fraud, we can also take away your license permanently. And this is what we define the failures as. So a class 1 and class 2 failure. The class 1 QA failure is a failure due to perceived rater misunderstanding, improper training, and or human error. For example, the rater unknowingly conducted the diagnostic testing improperly, or he or she made a mistake during the data entry process. So these are what you could consider human errors, honest mistakes, stuff like that. We're definitely willing to work with you on these particular mistakes. I mean, they're bound to happen. There's definitely a lot of rules, and I think it's normal if somebody makes a mistake every once in a while. Now, a Class 2 QA failure is a failure due to perceived rater negligence, improprieties, or general lack of willingness to provide truthful or accurate ratings. For example, a rater certifies a rating that he or she never conducted, or certified a rating knowing that it didn't meet prescribed standards. So as you can see, this class of failure is more along the lines of fraud or negligence. And when it comes to this type of failure, if we feel after the investigation is over that that is what you're doing, this is where we go into suspension or potential permanent decertification. So the potential rater violation of Cheers rater agreement. So once you complete the training and once you sign up with the Cheers registry, you'll be signing a Cheers registry agreement and a Cheers rater agreement. That's going to allow you to become a Cheers rater and basically have access to the registry and the database. So that agreement contains all the rules and regulations that we're talking about right now. You failing to follow those regulations after you sign the paper and basically going against what the Cheers rater agreement is potential grounds for decertification or basically being permanently removed from the HERS program. So per the standards, Cheers Rater Agreement, Cheers has the right, upon written notice, to decertify a rater for specified violation referenced in the aforementioned agreement, in the event that a violation is either reported to Cheers or discovered by Cheers through its QA process. And this is just an example. So at the bottom of each form that you'll be signing, and this is just a highlight of it, you'll see that it says, I certify the following under penalty of perjury under the laws of state of California. When you conduct a rating, you're conducting a legal inspection required by the state of California. You are an independent state inspector. Therefore, if you falsify paperwork, or again, conduct yourself in a manner that is not consistent with the rules that you sign and agree to follow, there can be legal consequences associated to that. And this is just a reminder of that to make sure that you understand that very clearly. So as far as the QA results I mentioned earlier, so notification of the QA results will be sent to the rater via email within 24 hours of the QA report being completed by Cheers QA personnel. Again, you have the right to know if QA was conducted, and obviously you have the right to know what the results of that QA was. Whether you passed or failed, obviously once you get the results, you always feel free to call us, and if you have any questions, need additional clarification, want additional details, obviously feel free to reach out to us and let us know. If we have any questions, we're going to reach out to you, so don't worry about trying to call us. And again, if you have any questions, contact us through the messaging system or give us a call.